My name's John Burke. I'm the district biologist for the National Wild Turkey Federation, and I also serve on the steering committee of the Missouri Bird Conservation Initiative and the annual conference committee. So the first thing I'd like to do is welcome everybody to the 2021 virtual version of the 18th Missouri Bird Conservation Initiative annual conference. MoBCI is an organization of 76 diverse conservation agencies and organizations with a common interest in bird conservation. I think two of the primary things that have led to the success of our organization and why we've been in existence for as long as we have is two of our primary focuses annually have been one, the annual grants program that puts about $100,000 of habitat improvements on the ground for birds. And the other is our annual theme-based conferences like this one, designed to focus attention on matters impacting birds. This year's theme focuses attention on the 3 billion bird decline, the urgency of it, and what it is and can be done to quote unquote slow the spread. Tomorrow during the first session, the urgency of decline and what the issues are will be addressed in 3 talks. And we're going to divide those talks into basically the 3 different suites of birds, grassland birds, wetland birds, and forest shrubland birds. And what is being, basically the urgency and what the issues are. And then the second set of talks will look at those same 3 suites of birds and what is being done, at the landscape level to address these, these issues. The third session is basically going to be covering what we as individuals can do kind of at the, I guess, the micro scale to help be a solution to the problem. We think, sometimes I think, and I'm guilty of it, when we talk about what we can do in our own yards or, infrastructure type related stuff, it doesn't seem like it's making a big difference. But if 300 million people decide to act, it stops being micro. Before I introduce our keynote, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping items. First and foremost, I'd like to thank my committee that helped with putting all this together this year, and many of them have been involved, in previous years as well. First on the list is Allison Vaughn, and by default, Doug Miller. They have been, instrumental in a lot of the behind-the-scenes work that goes into putting this conference on, in addition to putting together a newsletter and managing the website, and a lot of that stuff. A lot of that is Allison and Doug, and I thank them wholeheartedly for their efforts. They're, like I said, they do a lot, and again, I'm very appreciative of it. Also on the committee is Kelly Shrigley-Werner, Dave Graber, Michelle Gablesberger, who's also very helpful behind the scenes. The silent auction that we have available that I'll get into in a little more detail in just a minute or two. She put that all together. So thank you, Michelle. In addition, Gene Favre, Steve Hang, and Paige Weidick, and Chad Doolin are all on the committee. And Paige is kind of basically our Brooke Woodmeyer for tonight, and doing kind of the behind the scenes today. Thank you, Paige. And Brooke is also on the committee, and this is basically her first year on the steering committee. And she helped, basically she put this virtual platform together. So a big thanks to Brooke. As we move forward tonight and throughout the day tomorrow, if you have any questions, if you're experiencing kind of technical difficulties, please put those in the chat box, and then somebody, Paige or Chad or somebody on the steering committee will address those questions. And if you've got any questions for Mark or any of our speakers tomorrow, put those in the Q&A, and then Chad will basically read those off to the presenter after they present. Another thing I'd like to mention is our silent auction. As I mentioned previously, that is basically there's some individuals that will contribute directly to the foundation, but for the most part, that silent auction every year is basically our only source of income, and that helps. In previous years, that helped offset conference costs so that we could keep registration costs low. It also pays for other operating costs like managing the website and everything else. And it also, in previous years, we've actually been able to offer challenge cost share grants to affiliates to plug into things like NACA grants. So you can access I think you can get there on the chat box. There should be a link in there. If not, you can go to the MoBCI website and there's a link to the silent auction there. And it's not that complicated to sign up to be a bidder. Take a look at those items and please price your bids as you can. All of the items are at Conservation Federation of Missouri's office in Jefferson City. So if you are the winning bid tomorrow at 1 o'clock when we shut it down, that's where you'll be expected to pick it up. There are 2 items on that list that are not there, and that is every year Forest Keeling Nursery usually donates some plant materials, potted native trees and shrubs. Those are available, and they're basically, in the past, what we did was the top bidder got first choice of half of them, and then the second bidder got the other half. Now, we couldn't really do that with a virtual platform, so basically there's just 2 groups of 6, and if you're the winning bidder and you live closer to Ellsbury than I do, you'll probably have to go get them from the nursery. But if you're in the central Missouri area, Fulton, Columbia, Jefferson City, I'll make a run to Ellsbury and get the plants, and you can make arrangements with me to pick them up. So please check out between now and 1 o'clock tomorrow, check out that silent auction and place your bids. It is now my pleasure to introduce our keynote for this evening, Mark Robbins. Mark has been a collection manager of 2 major ornithological collections over the past 40 years. The initial 11 years were at the Academy of Natural Sciences, Philadelphia, and since 1993, he has been at the University of Kansas Biodiversity Institute. Mark's research interests have focused on biological inventory and the conservation of that diversity, alpha systematics, phylogeny, and avian contact zones. He has discovered and described several new bird species to science. He has published a number of papers on the status and distribution of birds in Missouri, culminating in his book, Birds in Missouri. His involvement in conservation has resulted in documenting the decline of the tallgrass prairie avifauna as a result of adverse agricultural practices. Mark has deposited over 12,000 bird audio recordings at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. He is a member of the South American Classification Committee of the American Ornithological Society and the Missouri Bird Records Committee. Mark will provide an overview of why birds are important, discuss the issue of disappearing birds, as well as what is being done and what more could be done to address this issue. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. It's great to be here, everybody. I hope everybody's dealing with heat and you've got a nice cold drink, maybe a glass of wine or a beer in front of you that'll make this more pleasurable. A lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight is kind of distressing, but there's going to be some positive parts of that. And let me bring up the presentation now. Can everybody see that? How's that? Can everybody see the?
Looks good.
Okay. So before I give this overview of the nearly 3 billion decline, this massive decline in the last 50 years, I want to give everybody kind of a deeper history of what's gone on prior to 1970. Because we can often lose focus of what happened since Europeans arrived on this continent. Passenger pigeon, everybody probably knows that it was considered certainly the most common bird in the New World. And many people think it was probably the most common bird on the planet. And the estimates for that were anywhere from 3 to 5 billion birds. And the bird became extinct in 1914. So that species alone equals or greatly surpasses what we've lost in the last 50 years. And that would have been probably a keystone species for eastern deciduous forests because they were probably a significant disperser of mast, and that is oak and hickory and other acorns. So we lost a key component of the ecological eastern deciduous forest when we lost passenger pigeon. But unfortunately, that wasn't all we lost. We lost seven other species here in North America. They're listed here with the last year of definitive documentation that the bird was still with us. Those 4 that are highlighted in blue once occurred in Missouri, along with passenger pigeon. And you can see that these were well before 1970. What is not apparent with these total of 8 species that we've lost is that there were literally hundreds of millions or billions of birds that were lost. And if you think about the tall grass prairie alone, most of it was gone well before 1970. So something like a Henslow sparrow, we probably lost 90% of the population before 1970. And you can echo that for many, many other species in North America. So in sum, billions of birds were lost before 1970. So to get to where we have a fairly good documentation of what we've lost over the last 50 years, it was first announced at the American Ornithological Society's meeting in June of 2019 in Alaska. And it was like a lightning bolt at that meeting because a lot of people, most people suspected there had been losses, but no one understood it was at that magnitude. The data for that were published in the premier journal Science in the fall of 2019. And I'm going to start going through and giving you an overview of the data as well as what we can do. And I'll start with what each individual can do, and we'll scale that up to a landscape issue. What I have done, because looking at what's going on tomorrow, and I certainly don't mind having some redundancy, it's always good to hear things a couple of times. I've truncated a little bit of my talk about windows and cats, because seeing what's coming up tomorrow. Now, you birders and attending probably know what this bird is. This is an adult male breeding plumage chestnut called longspur. It's a short grass prairie specialist, and it's suffered significant declines in the last 50 years. This is a schematic graph over here. This would indicate roughly the start 1970 down here to present. And you've seen we've gone through this massive decline. We've got a net loss of 2.9 billion birds since 1970. And that represents about 29% overall abundance lost during that 50-year period. And roughly 303 of our 529 breeding species have declined, and that represents about 57% of the species that do breed. Now, the data that documents this decline primarily comes from a technique called the Breeding Bird Survey. I imagine most of you are familiar with it. It's a 24.5 mile stretch of road. It's road-based, and it primarily documents passerine birds that are singing during June. And Missouri has established roughly 80 of those routes across the state, starting as early as 1968. So that captures the majority of species that I just shown with it have gone through this decline. But that's not appropriate protocol for something like a bald eagle or waterfowl. So there are other protocols used to assess water birds and raptors besides this breeding bird survey. Yet another source of documentation is radar data. And in this graph you see here, and it represents a 10-year period, each one of these circles represents a radar station here in the lower 48. A red dot indicates a decline, a blue dot, a red dot, decline, the blue dot, an increase, and a white dot, there's no obvious trend. And the larger the dot, the greater that loss or gain is. And if you look where we are and look down here, the lower left, we have been averaging 5% loss annually during this 10-year period based on the radar. So that radar is capturing birds flying over at night. So we've been averaging here in the Midwest a 5% decline annually. That's staggering. A bit of good news, if you will, is that 50% of the total loss of this nearly 3 billion birds is made up by 10 abundant species. And examples of that are horned lark, dark-eyed junco, which is a type of sparrow, savanna sparrow, and another one that's in that top 10 is white-throated sparrow, and that's a bird that migrates to the state in winters. And roughly 92 million white-throated sparrows have disappeared in the 50 years. And Redwing Blackbird, which is considered the most common bird in North America, also has suffered around a 92 million decrease. So again, 10 species explain about 50%. Fortunately, at least superficially, it looks great that 3 of these species are introduced. Hallelujah, yeah, right. House sparrow, starling, and rock pigeon. Well, the bad news is that those are generalists, and that's why when they are introduced to this continent, they've done so well and spread so across the continent. So the fact that these 3 generalists have gone through a massive decline during these 50 years is disconcerting. And by the way, all 3 of these are showing declines in their native distribution as well. So there's something going on there. Now, this is a graph breaking the increases and decreases in the North American fauna in this 50 years. The red pie chart is of approximately what we've lost, and the net loss, and that's 3.2 billion, and that's been offset by a gain of about 250 million birds. American sparrows constitute a big chunk of that. You know, I mentioned 3 of them, the junco, the savanna, and white-throated sparrows. And then if you look down here, we got wood warblers. And each one of these is complicated, and we need to keep in mind these are estimates. The wood warblers that have declined are things like Tennessee, orange crown, common yellowthroat, yellow rump warbler. All of those species are still quite common, but they've suffered huge declines. And so this is the point where we really want to keep them common, because we don't want those to become rare and have a crisis on our hands. A couple of warblers that have actually increased are like Magnolia and northern Perula. And let's take a couple of minutes thinking about northern Perula. Those of you who know the breeding birds in the state, you know that northern Perula, again, this is a bird that's really been increasing, is found over a large part of its distribution with cerulean warbler, which has declined and is a species of concern. So you're going, you can have literally in the same tree in the Ozarks, cerulean and Perula warblers singing. And you go, okay, why is one increasing and why is the other decreasing? Well, I think it's important to look at the entire life cycle of these birds to get a handle on what might be going on. Perula warbler primarily winters from Mexico through Central America, whereas cerulean warbler primarily winters from Colombia to Bolivia at the base of the Andes up in the foothills. And unfortunately, what's going on in that narrow elevational range where cerulean warbler is found is that coca and coffee is being planted, and so that land is being cleared. And to give a salute to the late Brad Jacobs, it's important that we think holistically about a bird's life cycle. Brad took Missouri conservation outside Missouri, thinking we can't just think about the breeding grounds. We got to think about the migration stopovers as well as the wintering grounds. So a salute to Brad. Looking over here quickly at the blackbirds, mentioned Redwing Blackbird, another blackbird that's suffered immense declines and is a species of concern because it has a very small distribution, is a tricolored blackbird in California. And then here in Missouri, during migration in winter, we have a bird called the rusty blackbird. And the estimates for what's happened to that bird in the last 50 years is that there's been a 90% decline. So that's very disconcerting. So let's look over here at what's been gained. I'm going to be talking more about vireos later, and ducks and geese and raptors. And you see the stats down below talking about how many bird families have been a population lost. 10 families have lost over 50 million. And then you see on the right here what's increased. Here's another way of looking at this. This is very broad characterizations of groups. You've got land birds. The loss is estimated 2.9 billion. Water birds, 21 million. Shorebirds. And remember that earlier slide I showed of one shorebird that used to occur in Missouri in spring that it's now extinct, the Eskimo curlew, and we came close to losing, for the same reasons, American golden plover and upland sandpiper. The good news is waterfowl. I know I'm going to be talking more about that later. Waterfowl is doing quite well. And as most of you know, we're aware of the many causes. Astounding figure is our furry friends that we love. Cats are estimated to kill 2.4 billion annually. That's annually in the continental 48. So extraordinary. Windows estimated about 200 million birds annually. And then towers, about 6.6 million. Keep in mind on towers, it's actually very few birds actually collide with the towers. It's the TV towers that have the guy wires, those support wires. And if you have moisture precipitation, whether it's fog or rain, a couple hours before dawn, that's when these towers really become killers, the towers with these guy wires. And you can see in the background of this slide all these dead birds, and those are from colliding with windows. A difficult thing to assess, but it's insidious, are pesticides. And then you've got the fractionating habitat, the oil and gas industry, fracking. You can see this is a picture out west of chopping up the landscape. And I just mentioned, I showed all those birds that had been killed by colliding with buildings that are lit up at night. Fortunately, some of the major cities are agreeing to adjust these lights. They'll turn off a majority of these lights during the peak migration, particularly during those critical hours when birds are coming down, those a couple hours before sunrise when they're coming from up high and dropping down. If we can turn lights off for a couple of hours from late April through May and again September, we can significantly reduce the number of birds killed. And then the 900-pound gorilla is, of course, climate change that we've created, and that is a big unknown. And we're seeing the effects of that. If you just look at the news every day, you can see what's going on. Here's another way at looking at these declines, and this is by biomes, by habitats. And these are color-coded. Here's the boreal forest. The one I want to concentrate on is this one in brown, and that's our grasslands. And again, here's the decline. And these colors over here are coordinated with the habitats over here, the biomes. And the one I want you to focus on is this one right here, that brown one, our grasslands. And then if you look over here, this would be 0 or no trend. There's positive here with the wetlands. And at the bottom with the biggest decline are grassland species. So grassland birds, the estimate is we've lost 700 million grassland birds since 1970. That represents an overall decline of 53%. And you take one species, eastern meadowlark, as emblematic of this decline. We've lost 3 of every 4 meadowlarks that were present in 1970. And that graph over here on the left is from our breeding bird surveys. Remember, there's 80 routes now. Not all of those are appropriate for grasslands. We're looking at that's confined to routes that are in northern and western Missouri where there's grasslands. That center part of this graph represents the mean for each year of how many counts. Let's say there's 20 counts that are appropriate for grassland birds in Missouri. These are confidence levels on each side. But you can see right here, the mean from roughly 1968 when the first ones were run in Missouri to recent precipitous decline. This is a Nature Conservancy graph, which I am sure that most of you have seen. Outlined in that kind of off-white and green is at least the former distribution of grasslands in North America. We've lost huge parts of the grasslands, particularly the tall grass, which I'll talk more about here in a second. And the midgrass and short grass are more intact. But what this graph doesn't show is the degradation of those grasslands are still present. And many things like overgrazing have significantly impacted those remaining grasslands. You've probably all seen this graph. This is another Nature Conservancy graph showing the former, in light green, distribution of tall grass prairie, and the dark green is what remains. I hope that a number of you got to see Walter Schroeder's video last week at the Missouri Prairie Foundation's annual meeting. What he did to document what was present at the onset of settlement in Missouri as far as grasslands is a Herculean effort, just an absolutely astounding effort what he did on his own of looking at those early land surveys. And his concrete estimate was that Missouri had a roughly 15 million acres of tall grass prairie. And now we're down to roughly 60,000 acres, and it's highly fragmented. The largest chunk of tall grass prairie left, and that's the Flint Hills that wasn't able to be plowed. At one time, greater prairie chicken back in 1950, the tall grass, the Flint Hills was considered the strong point for greater prairie chicken. That is no longer the case. Bird has primarily disappeared across much of the Flint Hills. And the Flint Hills are badly degraded. We wrote a paper, colleagues and I, on the annual birding that goes on in the Flint Hills. We want burning, otherwise it'll have succession go on there. But what we don't want is annual burning, particularly at the same time of year, because it's nuked that component of our tall grass prairie where it's heavily impacted insects, the herpetofauna, forbs, and so forth. So this graph doesn't really show the full picture. Here is an astounding publication. This was by Tyler Lark et al. That was published in 2020. This was reproduced in the Missouri Prairie Foundation journal, and that's where I saw it and went, oh my gosh, that's got to be incorporated when we inform people about what's going on in Missouri. Approximately 625,000 acres have been converted. And remember, this is not high quality. This is not virgin prairie. This is pasture and other grassland. Has been expanded just during this 8-year period. The darker the red, the more significant, the greater the expansion of cropland. And you can see Missouri, and then you look over in Iowa and southeast Nebraska, what has gone on during that period. And according to Tyler, they're currently looking at the 8 years prior to this to see what it looked like then. Of course, part of this was during the ethanol craze. Please keep this in mind when I show you a graphic on Dick Sissel here in a few minutes. Another thing, how to express this expansion during that same period, it's from the same publication, is the loss of estimated 28 million milkweed stems due to cropland expansion. And again, Iowa, horrendous, northern Missouri, and look what's going on in where the largest chunks of our native prairie is, a huge expansion of cropland there. And so species like grasshopper sparrow continue to decline. Upland sandpiper, again, we almost lost that bird. Upland sandpiper survived the hunting and degradation of the grasslands down in its wintering grounds in the cone of South America, where Eskimo curlew and bobolink currently winter. Eskimo curlew used to winter there. Upland sandpiper and bobolink still do winter there. And we think things are bad here with tall grass prairie. Of course, the estimate on tall grass prairie is we've lost 96 to 98% of the tall grass prairie. Well, the pampas grass where Eskimo curlew used to be, upland sandpiper and bobolink do winter still. It's less than 0.5% left. It's a miracle we haven't lost some of these other species that winter down there. So bobolinks. Bobolinks primarily breed in the northern third of Missouri. And one of the issues besides that conversion of grasslands to cropland is that if all of you who've gone across northern Missouri around the last few days of May, first week of June, you've noticed that's when most of the haying is done. And that's when bobolinks and all these other grassland birds have eggs and young in the nest. So there's heavy mortality during that period. I gave this talk to the Greater Ozarks Club Society just before COVID hit in February of 2020. And I talked about if we could delay haying from that around 1st of June to the latter half of July, it would make a significant difference. Even if we could convince 1 out of 10, 1 out of 20 landowners who hay to delay that, it could have a huge impact. I had a family come up to me after my talk and they said, we didn't know. They had 40 acres that they had, I believe it was in clover and sometimes in another crop. And they said they were going to change their practices from haying around the 1st of June to the end of July. So we can make a difference by educating people about when to hay. So there are reasons for hope. This has been pretty grim at this part, right? Let's talk about something positive. We can turn this thing around. And we've done it. When we banned DDT, look what happened. Bald eagle is no longer an endangered species. Peregrine, osprey, brown pelican, and many, many other species benefited from the banning of DDT. And I really want to recognize hunters for what they've done. It's an extraordinary turnaround on our waterfowl. Things were grim in the 70s, in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And what they've done, Ducks Unlimited, everybody buying the duck stamp, all these hunters. And we need to think that when in pothole country, when they are ensuring that there's going to be a good crop of waterfowl produced, there are a whole suite of other non-waterfowl species benefit from those grasslands and marshes that are adjacent to those potholes. Some of those sparrows I mentioned, like Savannah sparrow, a Nelson sharp-tailed sparrow, bitterns, American bittern. It goes on and on. So major kudos to hunters. I can't say enough about what they've done. Another great success story is whooping cranes. We came within a blink of an eye of losing that species, down to 21 individuals in 1941, now nearly 450 in the wild. This adult, and there's the adult, and here's the juvenile, were actually photographed in Southwest Missouri by Becky Wiley. So that's pretty cool. So whooping cranes are occasionally now showing back up in Missouri. They once were here, not rare, long before just at settlement. Another major success story is the Trumpeter Swan. In 1935, we're down to about 69 individuals at a refuge in eastern Montana, Red Rocks National Wildlife Refuge. Now we're over 70,000. And in winter, into some late November into January, you can go along the Mississippi River north of St. Louis, or you can go up the northwest corner of the state at Los Bluffs National Wildlife Refuge, and you can literally see 1,000 trumpeter swans in a day. Just an amazing success story. And here's one that it's not as obvious because it's a little, these birds are more secretive. Back prior to 1990, Cooper's hawk was primarily restricted in the Ozarks, and it was actually principally in the eastern part of the Ozarks, breeding where there were pines. These hawks preferred to put their nests in pines in the Ozark in heavily wooded forest. This was documented by a student at MU, published a paper on this. Well, starting around 1990, Cooper's hawks started breeding everywhere. They're in suburbia. You can walk through neighborhoods, whether it's Kansas City, Columbia, Springfield, St. Louis, and you can go several blocks and you find a pair, then you move on and there's another pair. It's amazing how Cooper's hawk now breeds throughout the entire state and in the region. Along with that, sharp-shinned hawk is increasing, and then another bird that's now breeding statewide is red-shouldered hawk. So we've seen a dramatic increase in a number of raptors. Of course, bald eagle is one of those. Osprey is another. Now remember that pie chart we showed of birds that had increased. Well, one group that's increased are the vireos, family Varionidae. We have 7 species occurring in Missouri. 5 of those breed, and the most common of those is the red-eyed vireo. And here's another graph from the BBC data showing from roughly 1968 to present. This is the mean here with confidence levels around that mean, showing there's been a steady increase. So you might go, okay, what's the story with red-eyed vireo? Well, probably one of the reasons is that with the regeneration of the eastern deciduous forest, and that's certainly the case in Missouri. Remember, around 1910, 1920, almost all the forest had been cut in Missouri. Well, that's regenerating, and this bird is doing well. And then with farther west in Kansas, in fact, where I live, there was hardly any deciduous forest. Well, now with the removal of bison and Native Americans, you have succession going on, and red-eyed vireo is now a common breeder in our region where it was not, there were no birds at all. Okay, so how can we turn this thing around? And I'm going to start with what everybody can do, whether you own 100 acres or whether you live in a condominium, what you can do. And let's start with our furry friends, the cats. As I mentioned earlier, 2.4 billion annually in the continental United States. And what's not commonly appreciated is well-fed cats continue to kill. Cats that are neutered and released continue to kill. So the simple solution is keeping cats indoors and keeping stray cats they shouldn't be released. And I'm not going to touch any more on this because I know tomorrow there'll be more in depth about this. But this is something we can all do. Here is one of the worst case scenarios for windows. This is where you've got windows at both ends of the room, particularly when you have birds that have a pursuit of a sharpshin or Cooper's hawk on their tail, and they're trying to get away. They think that they can fly through this area where you have windows at both ends of a room. What we should be doing is, when we're not in the room, is pull the shades or your curtains, or if you're in that room and you're sitting down at a table at one end, at the other end, pull those shades and curtains close. And tomorrow, Crystal Anton's going to talk about this in-depth study that's going on at Johnson County Community College, which is on the border of Missouri. And this is a photograph from Crystal showing one of the no-nos that you have with windows is planting trees right next to windows, because that turns out to be a major killer. And again, Crystal will tell you more about that tomorrow. And we can really turn things around. And what Crystal's going to present will be a model that can be exchanged with others across the country, maybe the world, of what we can do to reduce the killing from windows. If you're a landowner and you're making your living off that, if we can convince landowners to put a small percentage of land for birds aside, that can make a huge difference. One of my neighbors, for 7 to 8 months of the year, has hoop houses where they grow vegetables. In the foreground of those hoop houses, they plant various things. It depends on the year what crop they have in there. And then in the foreground, you can see that they hay. Well, I convinced them to leave this swale. And this next picture was taken from right over here, looking in this direction. Uh-oh, there we go. That's looking through there, and you go, wow, okay. They're not doing anything with that. They've set this aside for birds, but also insects, reptiles are also benefiting from this. One of the birds that's benefiting from this is dickcissel. Every year, there are a minimum of 3 or 4 pairs that breed in that swale, and they are successful because I see the adults feeding young. And remember, I showed that those figures of southern Iowa, southeast Nebraska, northeast Kansas, and northern Missouri, of where this cropland conversion's been going on at extreme rate. Well, this darker pink outlined right there is the core area of dickcissels during the breeding season. So we should be deeply concerned of what might be going on with dickcissel. But back to our friend Brad, you know, moving conservation beyond Missouri borders. There's another concern for dickcissel down in its primary wintering ground here in Venezuela. There's several issues going on there, and the population is very concentrated in a relatively small area. So again, we need to have that linkage of conservation from breeding grounds, stopover points, and a stopover point for the species, it's a hot spot, is the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, and then the wintering grounds. Another species that breeds in that same swale as those dickcissels is sedge wren. There's at least 2 to 3 pairs annually that breed in there. And sedge wren's one of the most unique birds, not only in North America, but in the world. And you go, what's that about? Well, every bird's unique. Well, this bird primarily breeds north of Missouri in May and June. And then about the 3rd week of July, they migrate, usually with a mild cold front coming out of the north, and they arrive en masse in northern Missouri in the grasslands and western Missouri as far south as Prairie State Park to breed again. So they have this dual breeding in the same season. It's amazing. And so we've gone from something everyone can do, and looking to a broader perspective, we want to support organizations that are doing large landscape conservation. And of course, part of that is going international. Missouri Department of Conservation and the Missouri Bird Conservation Initiative have been part of that, of supporting conservation in places like Honduras. And what's happened after the publication of this massive loss in the last 50 years is some of the same authors and institutions that they're part of have been having workshops, and they've had 3 in the past year. And it started with explaining what the issues were and what should be done. And this last one, which occurred just a month ago, focused primarily on the coordination and collaboration of multiple entities working together. And what's amazing, what I'm super proud of and blown away is the Missouri Bird Conservation Initiative, with its 76 organizations that have diverse perspectives on conservation, is the model for the entire rest of the country. Other states are envious of what this group, this consortium, if you will, is doing. So I want to congratulate you all and thank you for all that you're doing. I'll take questions now.
Hey, thank you, Mark. Appreciate that of it. As a reminder to the attendees, there is a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. You should be able to open that and ask questions if you have any on it. So I'll kick it off with one I had as you were talking, and that is, you referenced about halfway through, you referenced some pretty big losses due to house cats, windows, and towers out there. And that got me thinking, were those numbers raw for those events, or did those compensate at all for reproduction of bird species?
Well, okay, so remember, that's losses that are estimated, documented. So that's, let's say we're talking about windows and the estimate's 200 million. That's the loss just due to the windows. So that's from whatever population there is of a species. And some species are more prone to hit windows than others. Same thing with towers. So those effects are not uniform across the entire avifauna. Obviously, many of these things have no influence on waterfowl. Windows, towers, for the most part, cats are not influencing negatively waterfowl. Now, maybe climate change made that, and of course, pesticides as well. So did I answer your question with that?
That helped it. That helped something I wasn't thinking about too. I guess I'm just kind of interested too in reproductive capacity of birds and what we're seeing out there.
So clearly, when we're converting cropland or prairie pasture to cropland, we're reducing the capacity by significance. There's just no places for these birds to breed. And you can echo that for other habitats. Give you another example that came out in this third workshop of the Road to Recovery. There were a presentation where they estimate that 95% of the black rail breeding population along the East Coast of the United States and the Gulf Coast of Florida have been lost due to sea rise. So there are different influences on different parts of the avifauna. And that sea rise, of course, is affecting things like seaside sparrow, the saltwater sharp-tailed sparrow. And so they already have working groups to address that. But we may get overwhelmed by climate change. Some of these things that we're trying to do may just be drops in the bucket, if you will.
Yeah. we're getting a lot of compounding things going on.
Yes, right. That compounding of these things is maybe huge. Yeah.
All right. So John also had a question while we were talking, and he wanted some clarity around the conversion to cropland of it.
Mm-hmm.
He was wondering if you had some insight on how much of that was CRP, Conservation Reserve Program, that was possibly going back into production because of, well, economics.
I'm sure a large chunk of that was. I did not see the stats of going into the paper. I would need to do that. So the short answer is I'm pretty sure that is a big piece of it, but it's much more than that. Part of it was, the ethanol craze, and Tyler said that they're looking at the good at least 10 years prior to that to see what happened with regard to cropland conversion. So I'm hoping they're maybe even as soon as this coming year that they'll publish that and it give us a deeper understanding of the magnitude of the loss. But keep in mind, we lost most of our prairie long before 1970. So again, I don't think it's far-fetched to say that we may have lost 80 to 90% of our Henslow sparrows well before 1970.
Thank you on it. Okay, we have questions from the attendees coming in now. So our first one is, how is Brad's legacy of his work with South America being continued? He had a great relations with folks in Central and South America. Is that still going on with our Missouri partners?
I believe so. I don't know if Sarah Kendrick is a part of this. It'd be nice. I want Sarah to address that. Most of what Brad was doing was work in Central America because some of the data showed that many of the warblers and vireos and thrushes that breed in Missouri actually were winning in Central America. So that's why Brad was focusing on Honduras.
Okay.
But I would want Sarah to address that to give you an accurate assessment of what the current state of things are.
We may have to remember that one to get back to her then. I think she had a conflict for this meeting.
Did she? Okay. Okay.
Okay. So how do they document loss by cats and window strikes?
There are several papers on that. They've used different techniques. Some of it is they actually observations of the cats where they're monitoring a cat throughout the day and seeing how many, it's not only birds, it's small rodents and shrews. And my mammalogy colleague here at the Biodiversity Institute says he believes that they're killing many more mammals than they are birds. So, and of course, there's insects, grasshoppers, and things. So direct observation is one of the ways on the cats. Windows, they're actually monitoring different types of windows, and that's Crystal will be able to give you some precise figures tomorrow during her talk of they have different windows and different influences, like having vegetation right next to the window is a bigger killer. And they've shown that they can reduce the killing at these windows by doing a couple of things. Again, I don't want to steal her thunder. I want her to be able to talk about that tomorrow. But so that's that. And then the TV tower stuff. This is based on monitoring towers. We have a huge tower west of us. It's 10 miles west of Topeka. It's one of the largest TV towers in our whole region, and it has something like 27 guy wires. It doesn't kill birds every night during the peak of migration. Again, you need to have certain conditions, and it's usually that couple of hours just before sunrise when you have precipitation. And that's what's happened throughout the whole country, is monitoring these towers, and that's how you come up with these estimates.
Thank you. Okay, can you comment farther on the decline of the sparrow family as shown in the pie chart, with maybe specifics to habitat, neonic seeds, or insect decline?
Yeah, that's a big unknown, how these birds are being influenced by pesticides. That is a hard thing to document. Certainly habitat is the key for a lot of these things. And now I would have predicted that junco and white-throated sparrow were doing okay because of where they breed. They primarily breed up in the boreal forest. Junco does breed in the high mountains of the western United States, and perhaps with climate change, we're seeing their habitat move further upslope, and we may not be actually capturing where the abundance of these birds are with climate change. So in Canada, much fewer breeding bird survey routes, primarily in places like Ontario. So if climate change is moving these birds further north with succession, we might not be able to detect what is going on. Perhaps these birds are becoming much more common further north, and we're not surveying that. But we continue to survey those old routes where there are huge declines of that because perhaps of heat, and they're moving farther north. So it's a very complicated thing, and some of it you just shake your head. You go, why is that occurring with that species? So there are many, many unknowns to this, that's for sure.
And you brought it up again on the compounding effects that climate change can have on these things. And when you've got a migratory species like that, it's hard. It sounds like it's a little bit difficult to remember to open your mind to the entirety of its life cycle, especially that migratory part.
Right. Yeah, especially when they're going south of our border where there's fewer people to monitor what's going on. And then some of these species are going to the Amazon basin, like blackpoll, eastern wood pea, where trying to get a handle of those on their winter grounds would be extremely difficult. Cerulean warbler is one that we can get a handle on because you can access that habitat, and we know what's going on in that habitat, that conversion to coca and coffee. There's no question that that's negatively influencing cerulean warbler.
Yeah, that made me feel bad about drinking coffee every day.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
Yeah. For the species that were drastically reduced and then had their populations increase again, have there been any studies on genetic diversity in those populations? Are there any problems with a lack of genetic diversity?
That's a very good question. And the answer for most species is we don't know. Some of these smaller, more confined species, perhaps like a black-cap vireo or a golden cheek warbler, where they've done some genetic analyses, they can theoretically look at, see if there's been a loss of diversity. But remember, there might not be genetic material from pre-1970 that you could make that comparison to. So genetic, here at the Biodiversity Institute, we freeze tissues from basically every bird that is brought in. And many of these birds that are in the study that's going on at Crystal's place at the Johnson County Community College, as well as the study that's going on by the Missouri Bird Observatory down in downtown Kansas City, those birds are coming here. I prep some of those almost every day. We're taking genetic material and freezing that in cryogenetic vats that will be able to address some of these questions in the future.
Thank you. How large does a prairie restoration need to be to effective in helping grassland bird breeding?
Well, as I talked about, that little swale certainly helped sedge wrens and dick thistles. But for species like greater prairie chicken or lesser prairie chicken, you need large tracts of land. And to give you an example of that, Konza Prairie over near Manhattan, Kansas, that's one of the largest chunks of tallgrass prairie left. It's about 9,000 acres. And greater prairie chicken is on the verge of disappearing from that landscape. So you need large tracts of land. And I really think the problem in Missouri, I've been saying this for a quarter of a century with our greater prairie chickens, I really firmly believe that if you put Taborville Prairie, Prairie State Park, and Golden Prairie and made them contiguous without an open-ended, intensive predator control program, the species would not even survive in that large of a landscape. But we need to keep in mind, if we did do that heavy, extensive predator control, it's going to have a cascading effect for the entire community there, and we might negatively affect a whole suite of other grassland birds and the community as a whole. So the short answer is, the more land you have, the more you're going to be able to protect. And the prairie chickens are, as are all prairie grouse, are in deep trouble. The modeling for lesser prairie chicken, remember that a large chunk of its habitat is being converted to center pivot, where we're growing crops out in dry lands where crops should not be grown. So the habitat is being converted. If you go onto Google Earth and you dial into Elkhart, Kansas, which was in a core area of lesser prairie chicken, it's astounding the number of center pivot you see. The modeling for as climate change indicates that it's going to become much more drier in that region. Lesser prairie chicken has nowhere to go. So it's in deep trouble. The stronghold for greater prairie chicken now, because of what's happened primarily in the Flint Hills, is now in north central Kansas and in the eastern part of the grasslands in Nebraska, in the Sandhill part of Nebraska. So things look grim for our grouse, prairie grouse.
Yep. I think I'm new to MoBCI, and as people get to know me, my background is in natural community ecology on it. And prairies have always been interesting for the very reason that you're talking about, in part that I think we tend to define natural communities kind of from a top-down basis, looking at the plants to do that. But there's a lot of factors that I think can go into the definition of a specific natural community. And for me, with prairies, scale, how much landscape they cover is one of those.
For sure.
It's hard to have a true functioning prairie without the grandeur of the landscape behind it.
Absolutely, that is for sure.
There was some stuff in the chat I wanted to hit on before moving on to the other Q&A questions. First one is follow up to our coffee comment. There is some ethically sourced coffee out there. One person provided a link in the chat if people are interested in that. Take a little bit of the bad feelings away from us coffee drinkers of it. And Charlie, I think he's asking you this, is to tell the group about your bird book, info for your bird book. Is that?
Well, it's just a status and distribution compilation of birds of Missouri, and it's got a historical component back to the earliest information for the on birds of the state, and a revision of that occurred this past year, and it's try to keep it up to date, what's going on, high counts, low counts, and what we're seeing is in the many birds that are arriving earlier in spring, they're staying later in fall. And we're seeing on a Christmas bird count species that no one would have ever predicted wintering in the state. So this book just documents those changes.
Thank you. Okay. So following up on our talk on the grassland conversion, how is the cropland conversion measured and kept track of?
I imagine more and more they're using satellite data. That's, it used to be you'd have airplanes with pictures way back. In fact, that's how they can document what was there back in the 50s and 60s. But more and more they're using satellite imagery to calculate these losses.
Remote sensing is becoming a very powerful, well, it has been a very powerful tool for us.
Right. Unfortunately, we don't have that satellite data going back as deep as we'd like it.
Yeah, Google Earth, they have a history slider on there. How much old imagery there is a little dependent on what part of the country you're in.
That's for sure.
And I live in the southeast part of the state. I get a little annoyed because there's a big gap between the late 90s and the 80s on there. And then usually they're very pixelated.
Yeah, they are you go back to some of the earliest and it's tough to tell what's going on. You need someone who spent a lot of time looking at these images to interpret those earlier ones.
Yes, but it's better than nothing. So.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely.
Okay, we have a little more than 20 minutes left for the night, and we've got a few more questions. So,
okay.
What will the outcomes for the road to recovery? Am I reading that right? What will be the outcomes for the road to recovery meetings? How will those outcomes and recommendations be shared with others in the bird conservation community?
Very good question. There is a website for that. You can actually even see every workshop that's been presented so far. So just if you type avian road to recovery, it should bring that up. And then you can take a look at what's going on. That's only 3 workshops so far, all within a year. Pretty impressive. And that is definitely going to be shared with the whole community. And you've got the people from Cornell leading this. Pete Morrow, who's one of those authors that in that one slide I showed, I listed all the authors. He's at Georgetown. They were sponsoring this last workshop. So, and you've got U.S. Fish and Wildlife, state organizations. You've got working groups. They've got a working group for the black rail because of what's going on with that. So more and more of these working groups that employ multiple organizations, just like you see in MoBCI. MoBCI, it's awesome to see. You've got quail people, turkey people, waterfowl people, all the federal, state agencies, Audubon groups, and that's how it's got to work. But we need to keep in mind that the overwhelming majority of the land is in private hands. And back to that bobolink example, back to where we need to educate people, people who hay, to, if they can, delay that. And what we really probably need is a financial incentive that if a lot of them can get 2 crops of hay a year, what if we provided a stipend if you only hay once a year and you do it in late July? We might get a lot of people converting back to hay field. And remember, a lot of these birds are not specific. They don't need virgin prairie. So, and we've seen the reserve program, what that's demonstrated. So that's one way we can turn this thing around, is educating private landowners to do the right thing. But of course, many of those want an incentive. If you're making your livelihood off things on your land, like I showed, my neighbor who's doing multiple things to generate money, we need to help provide resources for that. A lot of people, once they know, like that family that came up to me at Springfield presentation, they just wanted to do the right thing. They didn't need an incentive. They just didn't know. So we can educate people, and we'll get a certain percentage doing the right thing just because it is the right thing. But I think for a larger percentage, we're going to need to provide an incentive.
I think you're right on that. That's something that competing with market dynamics is,
right.
It's always been a problem for natural resource management of it. Another thought I had when you were talking about, well, that just now and earlier in your conversation, is it's not a lot of hay production, agricultural production, even with hay at the scale it is almost a result of technology. How big our equipment is, that it's been made to operate more efficiently at large scale on it. If we could get some people rolling back, so maybe not only delaying hay in some areas, but having more of a mosaic in your hay field, portions of it that you don't cut on for a year might help with that too.
And then that extinct word, hedgerow.
Yes.
the quail people are going, yes, yes, yes.
Yes.
Yes. And
That's
certainly
right.
management for quail is right on for many of these other grassland species. And, you need to know your audience. The quail people can speak to this more than I can. If you come to talking to landowners about some rinky-dink bird like a grasshopper sparrow, they can't relate to it. But I tell you, there are a lot of people can relate. Oh, I used to hear quail calling. I used to flush them. They can relate to that group, and that can be your umbrella species, that species that gets you to convert people to do the right thing. So you need to know your audience of who you're talking to, that you can touch that button and go, oh yeah, okay, maybe I'll leave 20 acres of grassland instead of planting corns or soybean, and I'm going to leave a hedgerow along there. But
Yep.
it's about education, like everything, right? We've got a long ways to go, but that's going to be a key component of this. We can't just have organizations think they can go out and buy parcels of land. That will not do it. We need the majority of the landowners, part of them engaged in this.
Yes. Yep, absolutely. Okay. Our next one is referencing back to the beginning of your presentation, where you mentioned a bird that had declined by 90%. This person did not catch the name of it, and they wanted to know if you could talk about the primary reasons for the decline of that species.
Well, yeah, it was rusty blackbird. Again, it's a bird that migrates. It starts showing up in October, peak of migrations in October, early November. A fair number winter. They used to be much more common winter resident in Missouri before the boot hill was wiped clean, because they like flooded woodland for wintering. And if you look at what we've done in the boot hill, 99% of it has been converted to crops. It used to be Tupelo cypress swamp. That's where ivory-billed woodpecker was. So the answer to why that is somewhat of a mystery. Part of it has to do with clearing of flooded woodland in the southeastern part of the United States. Another piece of that is we continue to spray large blackbird roosts with defoliates and kill hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of blackbirds. So that's a part of it. And what we're not sure what's going on is what that bird breeds in bogs in the boreal forest. That's the piece of this puzzle that we're not sure how much it's contributing to the decline of rusty blackbird.
Thank you. And that actually, I think, leads pretty well into this question. Is it possible to quantify the effects of pollution, air pollution, water pollution, plastics in the environment?
Yes, in fact, they're doing that with plastics in the ocean. They're clearly documenting that, and more we realize that virtually every piece of water, drinking water, is polluted with plastics. Air pollution, if you look on what's going on out west, our satellite imagery is showing these plumes. What we had here a few weeks back, where a cold front came out of Canada, and everyone thought initially that the air pollution we were getting from the fires, the smoke, was actually coming from Colorado and Wyoming, was actually coming from British Columbia. And this cold front swept that down, where we were, about 10 days. Our air quality here, at least where we live here in Eastern Kansas, in Kansas City, was horrible. Nothing like what you're seeing farther west. So satellite imagery is documenting. You can see the amount of pollution coming out of China with satellites, the plumes of air pollution there. So more and more satellites are documenting pollutants. And again, more and more satellites are being put up all the time. And many of these satellites are for monitoring pollution, air quality. So we're getting more and more data all the time on that.
That's good. So I remember 2 or 3 years ago, I think a study came out discussing either micro or nanoplastics. I don't remember what it is, but ground up plastic particles that were disseminating. And well, I think the short of it was even being found in us. And I suppose those would be showing up in birds as well.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. Yep. The really tough one to document are pesticides. DDT was relatively easy because we know when it was introduced, we know what the effects of it, but these other insecticides are so insidious that you don't appreciate what all they're doing to the insect population. Of course, the birds are eating insects, on and on. So it's much more difficult to document. Yeah.
I don't even know what to say about that.
Yeah, right. It's tough to address that. I mean, the bottom line is we should reduce their use of pesticides, but all of us who are involved in management of our grasslands, because of all these invasive like Sericea, you almost have to use insecticides, whether you're using pasture guard or whatever, you just want to limit that. But unfortunately, that has to be part of our arsenal. Otherwise, our remaining prairies will be destroyed from Sericea if we don't fight that. So
need to work on finding that balance in there.
Yes, there's a balance that we're hoping for. Yeah.
Okay. We have about 6 minutes left before I think we'll shut it down for the night.
Okay.
So there's still a few questions.
Okay.
This one is, are there any financial incentives, aid programs for farmers that have hay and have breeding bobolink on the land to help encourage or make possible putting off that haying? So follow up to what we talked about a few minutes ago.
Well, there was a conservation reserve program, but beyond that, I don't know of any. I'm hoping that there'll be an influx of additional money into that program, and we'll get back to hopefully surpass what there was a few years ago. But I'm not aware of any, and that would be something that perhaps MoBCI should look into, that all these organizations, because when you mention that 76 organizations are part of this coalition, you get senators and politicians turning their heads. And so perhaps that's something this group can strive for, is something that incentive. And, we start small and hopefully it grows. And, one of the things I've learned is when a farmer or a rancher sees what's going on next door and he looks at it positive and goes, hey, I like that. You get people who may have said, no way in hell am I going to do that. And they see the benefits of it and they go, okay. And then if we can get them convert maybe a few 100 acres eventually. So we might start small, but we need to think big, right? So that's something that perhaps MoBCI should look into, is how can we provide incentives to turn things around for grassland birds in Missouri? And again, we don't need virgin prairie, but we do need, as you pointed out, Chad, fairly big chunks of prairie or pasture, grassland.
Right. Our restoration efforts, you can address different aspects through it. There's a range of things that you restore with the more you put into it. And fortunately, some of those large scale functions, which are habitat for generalist species, erosion control, water quality, even carbon sequestration, right, those come at the front end of a restoration effort of it. There's some more finite stuff that if we try to go full blown on a prairie restoration or any type of habitat, that you only get if you put a lot into it. But those functions that have the biggest impacts, they come at the front end. So you're absolutely right that just even addressing those matters. And while we were on this, this is what John prompted, why John asked his early question about CRP. CRP competes directly with market of agriculture on there. So while it is an incentive program, I think there are a lot of farmers that if they can make more money off of having a crop, they'll often choose to go that way.
Right.
So kind of, as you're saying, those programs need to be assessed and then balanced so that they're competitive in the actual market.
Right. Very good point. Very good point.
All right. You spoke of individual action up to the landscape level work. Can you comment on how our food choices and food systems drive habitat loss, increased pesticide use, et cetera, especially in the plains, the prairie?
Well, certainly going with local, and that tends to be non-corporation size outfits, right? And they generally shepherd better use of the land by going organic, by going local. So, and it's amazing how many people in this country are going that route. And then again, this example I showed with the swale, those people are doing organic, and people like that tend to listen more. If I did that slowly. I didn't ask them overnight. I said, hey, you've got this going on here. These birds are coming in. They're doing this. And it's also, I talked about in September, all the monarchs that are coming through that swale. Again, that's a very narrow piece of property. It's only about 200 yards wide. It's much longer. And the benefit of that on that land where they're doing multiple agricultural things is huge. And you think if you can get every 1 out of 10 landowner doing something like that, you're going to help a large number of the fauna. It won't help some of these species that need landscape size pieces, but we can help a lot of things, whether it's sedgerin, dick thistle, redwing blackbirds, all those things will benefit even with small types of land parcels.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna make this the last question tonight, and I think this is a good one to end on. Based on your many years of experience looking at bird populations in the Midwest, what do you think are the main 1 to 2 reasons for the decline since 1970? And what do you think the conservation community needs to focus on to make positive change in this trend? Seems like doing the same old is not going to cut it.
Well, true. I grew up in Northwest Missouri, a town named Maryville, and I used to run over to Lois Bluffs National Wildlife Refuge starting in 1968. Back then it was called Squaw Creek. And I can tell you that just that route alone, the change between 68 and now, what's happened to the conversion of many pastures and grassland to primarily corn, but soybeans is a huge component of it. And if you use Google Earth and you type in Bilby Conservation Area, and then you kind of pull back out, you see that is a postage stamp of a conservation area, which is a pretty big conservation area, but everything around it is surrounded by crops for miles and miles. So I would say in my lifetime, particularly where I grew up, the single biggest thing has been the conversion to cropland. I think on a positive note, what we're seeing with the regeneration of forests in the Ozarks, that's a very positive thing. The bird populations, whether it's Kentucky warbler, there's a whole suite of birds that are doing well in the Ozarks of Missouri. I'm more concerned about the wintering grounds there and where they migrate. And, Brad and I had these discussions all the time about, gosh, we're doing okay here in the Ozarks, but what we're not doing okay in is the land being cleared for bananas, et cetera, in the wintering grounds. So we need more and more coordination, cooperation by not only entities here in North America, but reaching out internationally, something like ABC, the American Bird conservation organization, that Conservancy, those kinds of things. And we need to work with locals in these other countries. That's imperative, because for these species that winter in Central and South America, it's not going to make a difference if we have all the habitat here and it all disappears en route or in the wintering grounds. We can't continue to destroy the Amazon basin. So it's a multifaceted thing that we need to do, and it can be overwhelming. And again, that's why I wanted to start what you can do at your house and work up, and then help with the bigger players at a landscape way by giving to, if we're focusing on grasslands, the Missouri Prairie Foundation, you know, at their meeting last week, they announced that they had this early this year, and something that happened just last week, $1 million contributions by private people for grassland conservation. So the Missouri Prairie Foundation is an awesome organization. The Missouri Nature Conservancy, what they've done at Dunn Ranch, I just wish we could expand that even more. Obviously, the Missouri Department of Conservation, heavily involved in lands for grasslands. And then how many organizations that are part of this coalition, you know, Quail Forever, et cetera, are involved in this. So we can't give up. We got to keep working at it.
Indeed. Well, Mark, I think we're close to our end of the session for the night. So thank you for joining us and spending your evening here, giving us this keynote speech. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure. I'm sorry I'm not going to be here tomorrow. We've got a Missouri Bird Records Committee meeting all day tomorrow morning, so I'm going to miss tomorrow. I apologize for that, but good luck with everything. And again, I can't say enough about this consortium. Keep up with the good work. We need to press forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay.
And for the attendees out there, I appreciate you all joining us tonight as well. I think sometimes it's hard to give up a Friday evening. I'm glad you did. And I hope several of you join us tomorrow. And as a reminder, please go check out the silent auction if you can. Thank you all. Have a good night.
Okay, bye.